The CEO signed the divorce papers while his wife was still wearing her housekeeping uniform. The sound of his pen scratching across the final page seemed louder than the winter rain striking the glass walls of the law office. Grace Miller stood near the door, her fingers wrapped around the strap of a faded canvas bag. Her shoes were wet, her sleeves smelled faintly of industrial soap, and a small tear ran along the cuff of her gray uniform. Across the polished table sat Ethan Miller, the man she had loved for 14 years. Beside him was Vanessa Cole. Vanessa wore a white designer coat and a diamond bracelet that caught the cold ceiling lights every time she moved her hand. She was not merely Ethan's business consultant. For the past 8 months, she had been the woman waiting in hotel rooms while Grace worked night shifts cleaning those same kinds of rooms across town. Ethan pushed the papers toward his wife. "Sign them, Grace." Grace looked down at the document but did not touch it. Only 3 years earlier, Ethan had been sleeping beside her in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling walls. He had called her his miracle then. He had promised that when his company succeeded, she would never have to scrub another floor. Now he was the CEO of a technology investment firm valued at nearly $80 million. And Grace was still cleaning offices at night. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "Dragging this out won't change anything." Grace raised her eyes. Her face was pale from exhaustion, but her voice remained steady. "I wasn't speaking to you." For the first time, Vanessa's smile disappeared. Ethan exhaled sharply and loosened his expensive tie. He looked irritated, as though ending a marriage were just another unpleasant meeting squeezed between business calls. "The settlement is generous," he said. "You'll receive enough to start over." Grace slowly opened her canvas bag. Inside was a lunch container, a pair of worn gloves, and an old blue notebook with bent corners. Ethan glanced at it and frowned. He recognized it. Grace had carried that notebook during the first 2 years of his company, when they could not afford an accountant. Every expense, every borrowed dollar, every late payment had once been written in her careful handwriting. She placed the notebook on her lap but did not open it. Vanessa watched the movement with quiet interest. Ethan's phone vibrated against the table. A message appeared on the screen, and his expression softened immediately. Vanessa noticed. "So," she said lightly, "did the transfer go through?" Ethan turned the phone face down. Grace's gaze moved between them. "What transfer?" "None of your concern," Ethan replied. Outside the office, thunder rolled over the city. Grace could hear the faint hum of elevators and the distant wheels of a cleaning cart moving along the hallway. Somewhere, another woman in another uniform was polishing floors beneath people who would never remember her name. Grace picked up the pen. Ethan relaxed. Vanessa smiled again. But instead of signing, Grace turned to the final page and carefully circled one sentence in the financial disclosure. Then she slid the papers back across the table. "This account number is wrong." Ethan's face tightened. Vanessa stopped breathing for half a second. Grace looked directly at her husband. "I kept every number from the day your company began," she said. "And someone has been moving your money." Before Ethan could answer, his phone vibrated again. This time, the message on the screen was from his bank. His smile vanished. The message from the bank contained only 11 words. "Your request has been denied. Account balance insufficient for transfer." Ethan read it twice. For a moment, the powerful CEO looked like a man standing at the edge of a dark room, unable to find the light switch. Vanessa reached for his hand, but Grace noticed the way her fingers trembled. "It's probably a system error," Vanessa said. Ethan forced a thin smile. "My finance team will handle it." Grace said nothing. She placed the old blue notebook back inside her canvas bag, pulled her worn coat around her shoulders, and walked out of the law office without signing a single page. The hallway was silent and cold. White lights reflected off the marble floor she had once been hired to clean. Her shoes made a soft squeaking sound with every step. No one followed her. By the time Grace reached the street, the rain had turned heavier. She stood beneath the narrow awning of a closed cafe, watching black cars glide past like shadows. Her bus would not arrive for another 20 minutes, and she had only $7 left until Friday. She opened her bag and touched the blue notebook. It had belonged to her father. He had been a quiet bookkeeper in a small factory, the kind of man who repaired his own shoes and reused tea bags because he believed nothing should be wasted. When Grace was 12, he taught her how to read financial records by turning numbers into stories. "A missing dollar always leaves a footprint," he used to say. Grace had never attended an expensive university. She had studied accounting at night while working mornings in a grocery store. But before she could finish her final year, her mother became ill. Grace left school to care for her. Then the medical bills came. Then her father died. Then every plan she had made for herself disappeared beneath envelopes stamped past due. Years later, she met Ethan while cleaning tables at a diner. He was handsome, restless, and almost completely broke. He carried business plans in a cracked leather folder and spoke about building something that would change their lives. Most people laughed at him. Grace did not. She used her father's notebook to organize Ethan's debts, expenses, investor promises, and unpaid invoices. She sold her mother's wedding ring to cover the company's first payroll. At night, she cleaned offices. During the day, she checked every number Ethan brought home. He once kissed her hands and said, "When I make it, we make it." Grace had believed him. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. That evening, she returned to the basement apartment she had rented after Ethan moved into a luxury penthouse to be closer to work. The ceiling pipes groaned. The radiator barely worked. A single lamp cast warm light over a narrow bed and a folding table. Grace removed her wet shoes and opened the notebook. For months, she had been quietly copying details from the financial statements Ethan left at home. At first, she had done it out of habit. Then she began noticing strange payments. Consulting fees. Foreign accounts. Companies with different names but identical addresses. And always, somewhere near the transactions, Vanessa Cole's signature. Grace turned to the final written page. There, beneath a list of transfers totaling more than $6 million, was a date circled in red. It was the date of the divorce hearing. Grace stared at it for a long time. Then her phone rang. The caller ID showed Ethan's lawyer. When she answered, a nervous voice whispered, "Mrs. Miller, I think you were right." Grace closed the notebook. "About the account?" "No," the lawyer said. "About the woman sitting beside your husband." Grace arrived at Ethan's headquarters the next morning wearing the same gray cleaning uniform. The lobby was all glass, steel, and pale stone. A 12-foot company logo hung behind the reception desk, reflecting the white light like a badge of power. Employees crossed the floor with coffee cups and polished shoes, barely noticing the woman carrying a faded canvas bag. But security noticed her. "Ma'am, you can't go upstairs." Grace placed Ethan's lawyer's business card on the desk. "He asked me to come." The guard glanced at the card, then at her uniform, as if one of them had to be fake. Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened. Vanessa stepped out with two executives behind her. Her white coat was gone. Today she wore a dark red suit and the calm expression of someone who believed the building already belonged to her. When she saw Grace, she stopped. "What are you doing here?" Grace met her eyes. "Looking for the truth." The executive slowed, pretending not to listen. Vanessa walked closer and lowered her voice. "You've already lost your husband. Don't humiliate yourself trying to take his company too." Grace did not flinch. "I don't want his company." "Then leave." "I want to know where the money went." For a second, something hard moved across Vanessa's face. Then she smiled and turned to the security guard. "She is emotionally unstable. Remove her." The words traveled through the lobby faster than a shout. People stopped walking. Grace felt dozens of eyes settle on her stained sleeves, her worn shoes, her bag with the broken zipper. She could almost hear what they were thinking. The abandoned wife. The jealous cleaner. The poor woman who could not accept that the CEO had chosen someone better. The guard stepped forward. Grace quietly opened her bag and removed the old blue notebook. Vanessa's gaze locked onto it. That was all Grace needed to see. "Give me that," Vanessa said. "No." Vanessa reached for the notebook, but Grace pulled it back against her chest. The sudden movement drew Ethan from the elevator. He had not shaved. His tie was loose, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. For the first time in years, he looked more like the frightened young man from the diner than the CEO whose photograph appeared in business magazines. "What is going on?" Vanessa turned toward him immediately. "She broke into the building and is making accusations." Grace looked at Ethan. "Your lawyer called me." Ethan's face changed. Vanessa noticed. "What did he say?" she asked. Before Grace could answer, Ethan grabbed the notebook from her hands. He flipped through the pages, faster and faster, his breathing growing uneven. "You copied confidential information. I recorded the numbers you brought home. You had no right." Grace stared at the man who had once begged her to check every invoice because he trusted no one else. "I had every right when my name was still tied to your debts." Ethan slammed the notebook shut. Security escorted her out. The lobby remained completely silent. Grace did not argue. She did not cry. She simply held out her hand. "My notebook." Ethan hesitated, then gave it back. As the guard led her toward the revolving doors, Vanessa leaned close enough for Grace alone to hear. "You should have signed yesterday." Grace paused. Vanessa's perfume was sharp and expensive, but beneath it was the faint smell of smoke. The same smell Grace had noticed months earlier on envelopes Ethan said came from his private bank. She turned slowly. On Vanessa's wrist, partly hidden beneath her sleeve, was a thin burn scar shaped like a crescent. Grace had seen that scar before. Not on Vanessa. In an old newspaper photograph folded inside her father's notebook. Grace looked at her and whispered, "That isn't your real name." Vanessa's smile disappeared. Vanessa recovered first. She gave a small laugh, but it sounded too sharp in the silent lobby. "You're delusional." Grace kept her eyes on the crescent-shaped scar. Years ago, after her father died, she had found a newspaper clipping hidden inside the back cover of his notebook. It showed 3 employees leaving a courthouse after a factory investment scandal. One woman had hidden most of her face beneath a scarf, but her wrist was visible. The scar was unmistakable. The name printed beneath the photograph was not Vanessa Cole. It was Laura Bennett. Grace turned toward Ethan. "Ask her where she worked 12 years ago." Vanessa's voice hardened. "This is ridiculous." Ethan looked from Grace to Vanessa. "Answer her." "I don't owe your wife an explanation." "She's still my wife," Ethan said. The words seemed to surprise even him. Vanessa's expression changed. The warmth vanished from her face, leaving something cold and calculating beneath it. Grace opened the notebook and carefully removed the folded clipping. She placed it on the reception desk. Ethan stared at the photograph. The woman in it had been accused of helping move investor funds through several false consulting firms. The case had collapsed when the main witness disappeared, and she had never been convicted. But the companies named in the article looked painfully familiar. They were nearly identical to the companies now receiving millions from Ethan's accounts. One executive stepped closer. "Those addresses," he whispered. "I've seen them in our quarterly reports." Vanessa turned on him. "Go back to work." No one moved. Grace opened the notebook to the pages she had written during the company's earliest years. Her father had taught her to mark repeated numbers, unusual dates, and matching addresses with tiny blue dots. The same pattern appeared again and again. Payments split into smaller amounts. Contracts approved just below the level requiring board review. Accounts opened under temporary subsidiaries. Vanessa had not stolen the money all at once. She had taught Ethan to move it for her. She had called it asset protection. She had told him divorce could become ugly. She had convinced him to transfer nearly everything before Grace could claim a share. Ethan's hands began to shake. You said the funds were secure. Vanessa folded her arms. They are. Grace looked toward the glass conference room above the lobby. Several members of the finance department were watching from behind the railing. Then tell them to open the accounts. Vanessa said nothing. Ethan pulled out his phone and called the chief financial officer. Freeze every transfer connected to Cole Advisory. The answer came through the speaker. A long pause. Then a frightened voice said, "We can't freeze them, sir." Why not? The accounts were emptied at 6 this morning. The lobby seemed to lose all sound. Ethan's face went white. How much? The CFO swallowed. Almost everything liquid. Company reserves, personal holdings, the emergency credit line. Ethan stared at Vanessa. She did not look frightened anymore. She looked tired. As though the performance was finally over. You used me, he whispered. Vanessa stepped closer. No, Ethan. I showed you exactly who you were. He looked as if she had struck him. Grace watched the truth settle across his face. He had betrayed his wife to protect his fortune. And the woman he chose had taken the fortune before the divorce was even final. Suddenly, Vanessa's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then toward the main entrance. Outside, a black car had stopped at the curb. She moved quickly. But Grace saw something no one else noticed. Vanessa did not head toward the revolving doors. She turned toward the employees' service corridor. The same corridor that led to the loading dock. Grace grabbed the old notebook and ran after her. Stop her, Ethan shouted. By the time security reached the hallway, Vanessa had disappeared. But Grace stood beside an open service elevator, staring at a small black flash drive on the floor. She picked it up with trembling fingers. Written across the side in silver ink were 2 words. Final account. The black flash drive sat in the center of the conference table like a tiny sealed coffin. Ethan's security team had tried 3 different computers, but every attempt triggered a warning that the files would erase themselves if the wrong password was entered again. No one wanted to touch it. Grace stood beneath the cold lights, still wearing her cleaning uniform. Around her, lawyers, executives, and financial officers spoke in low, frightened voices. Hours earlier, many of them had watched security escort her from the building. Now they were waiting for her to save it. A young man entered the room carrying a laptop beneath one arm. His name was Noah Carter, the company's head of cybersecurity. His suit was inexpensive, his hair was uncombed, and unlike the others, he looked at Grace without judgment. I heard you found this, he said. Grace nodded. Noah glanced at Ethan. Everyone else should leave. Ethan stiffened. This is my company. It was also your security system, Noah replied. And she walked through it for 8 months. The room emptied. Only Ethan, Grace, and Noah remained. Noah connected the flash drive to an isolated laptop. A screen appeared containing rows of meaningless letters, dates, and symbols. Ethan stared at it hopelessly. Grace did not. She slowly removed the old blue notebook from her canvas bag and opened it to the first pages her father had written decades earlier. The symbols were the same. Her father had created the code while working at the factory involved in the old investment scandal. He used it because he believed someone inside the company was altering the books. That someone had been Laura Bennett. Vanessa Cole. Grace's father was the missing witness mentioned in the newspaper clipping. He had not disappeared because he was guilty. He had hidden after receiving threats, protecting the original financial records until the investigation collapsed. The stress cost him his job, his home, and eventually his health. But he never destroyed the evidence. He placed it inside the notebook and taught his daughter how to read every mark. A missing dollar always leaves a footprint. Grace had thought it was only a lesson about bookkeeping. Now she understood it had been a warning. Noah watched as she translated the first password. The drive opened. Hundreds of files appeared. Bank transfers. Recorded calls. Forged signatures. Copies of passports under different names. There were instructions showing exactly how Vanessa had manipulated Ethan into moving his assets beyond Grace's reach. There was also a folder labeled Miller Divorce. Inside was a recording. Vanessa's voice filled the room. "He'll transfer everything because he's terrified his wife will take it. Once the divorce hearing begins, I'll be gone." Ethan lowered his head. Grace did not look at him. Noah opened another file and suddenly froze. "This account is still active." Ethan stepped forward. "Can we recover the money?" "Maybe," Noah said. "But only because the final transfer requires 2 identity confirmations." Grace turned toward him. "Whose?" Noah looked at the screen. "Ethan's, and yours." Ethan stared at Grace, confused. She understood immediately. Years ago, when the company had no credit and Ethan could not open a business account alone, Grace had signed as its original financial guarantor. Vanessa had removed Grace from every visible document, but she had overlooked the oldest banking agreement. One forgotten signature had stopped the last transfer. Noah looked at Grace with a faint smile. "You saved the company before you even entered this building." Grace remembered the night she had first met Noah, years earlier, sleeping in the company's storage room because he had been evicted. Ethan had wanted him fired. Grace had brought him food, paid the fee for his certification exam, and convinced Ethan to give him another chance. Noah never forgot. That small kindness had placed the one person capable of protecting the evidence in the room at the exact moment they needed him. Ethan's voice broke. "Why are you still helping me?" Grace closed her father's notebook. "I'm not helping the man who betrayed me," she said. "I'm protecting the people whose paychecks you almost lost." The following morning, the divorce hearing began. Ethan entered the courtroom without Vanessa, without his fortune, and without the confidence that had once filled every room. Grace entered carrying the blue notebook. And behind her walked 2 federal investigators. The courtroom doors closed behind the federal investigators, and every whisper in the room died. Ethan sat beside his lawyer beneath the pale morning light, looking smaller than Grace had ever seen him. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His hands rested motionless on the table. The man who had once walked through glass offices as if nothing could touch him now stared at the floor like someone waiting to hear the final cost of his own choices. Vanessa's chair remained empty. The investigators had located her before dawn at a private airfield. The evidence on the flash drive connected her to years of fraud under multiple identities. Most of the stolen money had been frozen before it could disappear overseas. But not everything could be recovered. Ethan's company was damaged. Investors were leaving. His reputation had collapsed overnight. The judge reviewed the financial records, the secret transfers, and Ethan's attempts to hide marital assets before turning toward Grace. "Mrs. Miller, are you requesting ownership of the company?" Grace looked at Ethan. For 14 years, she had stood beside him when he had nothing. She had sold her mother's ring, cleaned offices until her hands cracked, and believed every promise he made. Now she could have taken control of what remained. "No," she said quietly. "I only want what is fair." Ethan finally raised his eyes. Grace continued. "The employees should not lose their jobs because of what he did. Protect their wages first. Then settle the divorce." A faint murmur moved through the courtroom. Even Ethan's lawyer seemed surprised. The judge approved an emergency restructuring plan. Grace's original financial stake, documented in the blue notebook and confirmed by early company records, gave her enough authority to help protect the employees while an independent board took control. Ethan would no longer be CEO. When the hearing ended, he found Grace alone in the courthouse hallway. Cold sunlight spilled across the stone floor. She was wearing a simple navy coat, but her old canvas bag still hung from her shoulder. "I thought money made me powerful," he said. Grace stopped. "It only showed you what you were willing to lose." His eyes filled with regret. Can you ever forgive me? Grace looked at the man she had once loved, then at the divorce papers in her hand. One day, I may forgive you. But forgiveness is not the same as returning. She signed her name. This time, her hand did not tremble. 6 months later, Grace stood inside a renovated brick building on the quiet side of the city. A small sign near the entrance read Miller Community Finance Center. She had used part of her settlement to create free evening classes for cleaners, drivers, single parents, and low-income workers who wanted to understand contracts, debt, and personal finances. Noah volunteered there twice a week. The company survived under new leadership, and every employee kept their job. Ethan sold his penthouse and began working as a junior consultant at a small firm. For the first time in years, he had no assistant, no private driver, and no one to blame. One rainy evening, Grace noticed a young cleaning woman standing outside the center, holding an overdue notice in one hand. "I'm not good with numbers," the woman whispered. Grace opened the door wider. "Neither was I, once." She placed her father's old blue notebook on the desk between them. The corners were bent, the pages were faded, but the words inside had saved more than money. They had saved hundreds of families from paying for one man's mistake. Grace smiled and turned to the first page. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one who sees the truth clearly. And sometimes losing the life you beg to keep is how you finally find the life you deserve. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that dignity is worth more than wealth. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about kindness, courage, and second chances.